For the purpose of my presentation and in the interest of staying within the limited time of the presentation, I'm going to rely on the presentation which is in the book, but I'm going to start not from the beginning. I'm going to start from section 2. Cognitive agency and the synthetic unity of our perception. So very briefly what the idea is the following in my paper. Suppose you have a computer and suppose that you get the news, as I got the news in 2017, that somebody is going to use Kant's architectonic in the first critique in order to program that computer. And moreover, they say that with the help of that program, the computer is able to do better than so far other computers have done. So the task is a verbal reasoning task. The computer gets certain inputs, in particular a string of letters, and then the computer is expected to make sense of those letters to respond. And impressively, the computer responded with a speed which was equal, if not better, than human speed, and with answers that made sense more or less in the same way in which they make sense when a human being responds to the same verbal reasoning task. So that was quite interesting, I thought. But the further claim was that the computer equipped with this software is also a cognitive agent. So what I'm trying to do in the paper is to examine the extent to which we can call such a computer a cognitive agent. Now, there is a distinction here between a merely sensory agent and a cognitive agent who might also be at the same time sensory. So consider a merely sensory agent, such as a thermometer. Now, first of all, what do we mean by agency? I take agency to refer very generally to a capacity to do something. So if we are to consider a thermometer as a sensory agent, then as an agent, that thermometer is doing something, maybe measures temperature. Now, a sensory agent has sensors, and in order to make this more evident, we can consider a more complex case, not simply the case of the thermometer. Let's consider the case of a thermostat. Let's consider that we have a thermostat in an aquarium. Sometimes an aquarium needs a thermostat because the temperature of the water for the fish needs to stay at a certain level. If the aquarium is housing some tropical fish, then I'm told the temperature needs to be between 25 and 27 degrees Celsius. Now, when the thermostat's sensors indicate low temperature, then the thermostat will react by switching on the aquarium heater. So the thermostat reacts to perturbations of its temperature sensors, and it is in this sense a sensory agent. It does something on the basis of sensations or on the basis of perturbations of its sensory apparatus. However, we usually say that the thermostat does this automatically. In other words, switching the aquarium heating on is not done because the thermostat counts the perturbations of its gauge as its representation of the water's low temperature. The thermostat doesn't count perturbations as a representation of temperature. And important for those who take the computer to be a cognitive agent, is precisely this idea of counting as. And we are familiar with this idea of counting as from social sciences, in general for social practices. In our day-to-day lives, social practices count as specific things. Imagine a happy event like a marriage. Many things happen during a marriage. We count what happens as marriage when certain conditions are met. So usually we say that there are certain activities, they count as marriage when the context is appropriate. But moreover, we need someone who is counting those activities under the appropriate context, in the appropriate context, as an instance of marriage. So what we do, or rather what that who counts the activities as marriage, what that person or being does is to take a rule we have with regard to marriage and to try to subsume under that rule a set of activities, and then we would call that marriage. So this is what counting as usually means. Now, we don't talk about the thermostat as counting its perturbations of its gauge as a change in temperature, although we might talk sometimes about the thermostat as, perceiving a change. And what we do, although we are aware that in fact what the thermostat is doing is just an automatic response, what we do is indirectly to attribute intentionality because we are intentional agents. So there is this idea of a distinction between original and derivative intentionality. In order for the thermostat to be seen as having intentionality which is derivative, we need an original intentionality, that is I who is counting what the thermostat is doing as a particular kind of activity. I'm attributing that intentionality to the thermostat. Okay, this is important because that's what is crucial about the distinction between a merely sensory and a cognitive agent. So unlike a merely sensory agent, a cognitive one is a sensory agent who, in addition to behaving in response to his sensings, also counts his sensings as his representation or presentation of an external world. So we have here an agent who also has original intentionality. So a cognitive agent needs to be an agent who has original intentionality. And this is not something I'm saying, this is something that those who claim that computers are cognitive agents attribute to computers. What I'm doing is to question whether there is something like original intentionality in the case of a computer which has a Kantian program installed. Okay, now the move from a merely sensory agent to a cognitive agent can be understood, at least in part, as the result of the way in which this cognitive agent combines the plurality of sensings, of what it senses, obtained by the sensors. So the cognitive agent is also a sensory agent, but is more than that, and namely is more than that because it combines the plurality of sensings. Now, consider a program that includes rules of composition, a program which combine rules which combine parts into wholes. So for instance, you may have a program that may be permitted to combine a group of sensings representing a nose with a group of sensings representing an ear under the totality of a face. So you may have, for instance, a pattern recognition program that it's recognizing a nose and an ear and then puts those together and says, here is a face. Now, on the Kantian model of cognitive agency, the activities of combination are similar to social practices. So for those who claim that the computer is a cognitive agent, the computer who has a Kantian program is a cognitive agent, they think that the activities of combination are similar to social practices as discussed in the case of marriage. Thus, both composing and connecting are done by something else in the same way in which I cannot. So in the case of composing and connecting, I don't do this directly. Similarly, when I'm getting married, I'm not just getting married, I need to do certain things in order for me to get married. And those things I do are then counted as marriage. Similarly, in this case, composing and connecting are done by doing something else. Namely, they are done indirectly by doing those other things. So in general, activities of combination would be performed by constructing certain rules which permit or obligate me to combine representations in a certain way and then apply those rules. So combinations are performed indirectly too, through the construction and application of certain rules. And these are the rules that you can find in a computer. So to sum up the position of those who take computers to be cognitive agents, the Kantian program-based account of cognitive agency claims that a cognitive agent counts his sensings as representations of the external world. Moreover, the claim is that in order to do so, the cognitive agent needs to combine these in a certain way, and in order to combine his sensings in an appropriate way, he needs to construct rules and apply them. Yet, on a Kantian account of representation, or sometimes translated as presentation, Vorstellung in the most recent translations, usually you get a variation. Sometimes some translate Vorstellung as representation, sometimes as presentation. I opt for presentation. So on a Kantian account of presentation, we can only present something and hence have presentations when these presentations are connected with a possible consciousness of having them. And this is a famous quotation from Kant. Again, it's in the paper in this book. Quote, "The I think must be capable of accompanying all my presentations, for otherwise something would be presented to me that could not be thought at all," which is equivalent to saying that the presentation either would be impossible or at least would be nothing to me, end of quote. So that's a quotation from Kant's first critique. Now, it's often pointed out that Kant here doesn't require every presentation to be actually accompanied by this consciousness of having it. All that is needed is the possibility of this consciousness. So it follows that in order for a being to count its own activities as it's representing something or presenting something, the presenting process of counting as should be accompanied by the possibility of a consciousness of this process. And this is a point that Kant also makes explicit in the first edition of the Critique, and I quote here, "All presentations have a necessary reference to a possible empirical consciousness, for if they did not have this reference, and becoming conscious of them were entirely impossible, then this would be tantamount to saying that they don't exist at all." End of quote. So here Kant presents an argument which is a reductio. In fact, he starts from the contradictory of what it is to be demonstrated, starts by assuming that there is a presentation without a necessary reference to a possible empirical consciousness, and concludes that in order to exist, presentations must have a reference to the possibility of consciousness. And the argument is that if a presentation might not have reference to a possible empirical consciousness, then it might be impossible for a person to become conscious of that presentation. Yet if a person cannot become conscious of a presentation, then that presentation cannot be that person's presentation, and hence cannot exist as that person's presentation. And perhaps the clearest way to see how the argument works is an analogy with a fictional idea. If I say I create a character for a short story, then that character's existence depends on the representing activity I perform through imagination. If it is impossible for me to be conscious of this character, then I cannot imagine it, and hence it cannot exist as my creation. And the same goes for any of my presentations or representations. If I cannot be conscious of them, if I cannot associate them with a possible consciousness, then I cannot represent them, and hence they cannot exist. And that's Kant's argument. Now, of course, in some cases, the link between me and my presentation is not the focus of my attention. I may be conscious of a particular presentation without being explicitly aware of it as my presentation. In which case, this is a presentation of which I am conscious, but which is not accompanied by the I think or by a consciousness of the presentation as mine. And this can be easily noticed in many cases. I was coming from the airport to the hotel by train the other day, just looking through the window, beautiful landscape. Of course I was conscious of the landscape. Of course I was conscious of myself as seeing the landscape, but not explicitly. Only later, by reflecting on what I was doing, I could say that was my presentation of a landscape. That was me looking at the landscape and seeing a beautiful landscape. Normally what we do is we see things, but we are not explicitly aware of ourselves as doing that. We are usually absorbed into the activities we are doing. So again, applied to the presenting process of counting as, which is crucial for the notion of original intentionality and hence for the notion of cognitive agent, what this implies is that the cognitive agent can only take its sensory perturbations as representing activities of an external world if this presentation of the sensory perturbations is linked to a possible consciousness of the presentation as the agent's presentation. Okay. Now, this is a condition for a second condition, which is a fundamental requirement for cognition in general. So according to Kant, cognition relies on the principle of the original synthetic unity of apperception. Kant regards this principle as the primary pure cognition of understanding, entirely independent of all conditions of sensible intuition. That was a quotation from Kant. The role of this synthesis is to make possible the unification of the manifold, both under concepts and under intuitions. As Kant puts it, quote again, "Not only do I myself need this condition in order to cognize an object, but every intuition must be subject to it in order to become an object for me." End of quote. So what happens here, Kant takes cognition to refer to intuitions, concepts, or in the case of what he calls the proper meaning of cognition, a synthesis of intuitions and concepts. And he says that in all these cases of cognitions, a synthesis is required. Whether it's a synthesis of sensations or of marks for concepts, or of both intuitions, sensations, and marks. And this synthesis is made possible by this what I called and what Kant calls this a priori synthesis of the transcendental unity of apperception. So Kant sees this principle of the synthetic unity of apperception to be a condition which makes possible all thought. Okay. Now, as we have seen, each of our presentations is potentially accompanied by a possible, by a consciousness of the presentation as our presentation. Cognitions are presentations, which refer to an object. This objective reference, for this objective reference, the understanding needs to synthesize under a rule the manifold of the elements, whether these are marks or concepts or sensations. So we need this, synthesis, and through this synthesis we obtain the cognition. And this rule is given by this original synthetic unity of apperception. Kant calls it an a priori, considers to be an a priori unity, and it is an a priori unity created by apperception, and for Kant apperception is self-consciousness. Now, every aspect of my experience, whether a sensation, a conceptual mark, an intuition, a concept, or a combination of these, is an aspect of which I'm potentially aware as an aspect of my experience. Hence, every aspect of my experience presupposes a potential link to a form of self-consciousness. So the original synthetic unity of our perception is the mode in which aspects of our experience are formed so that they are potentially linked to the same consciousness, namely my consciousness, my identical consciousness. And I call this original apperception self-consciousness, since it is a form of self-consciousness, but one in which I'm not reflecting on a self or ego, but on an aspect of experience as an aspect of my experience. So in this case of self-consciousness, the self as such is not explicitly posited. The identity of the self is only presupposed by the a priori synthetic unity of apperception. Now, what is unclear is whether this synthetic unity of apperception, which seems to be required by every aspect of my experience, whether we can find anything like that in a Kantian machine. Now, how am I doing about time? Do I still have 5 or 6 minutes? Okay, thank you. That's fine. Okay. I'm not going to rush through this final page or 1 page and a half of my presentation in 5 minutes. I'm going to try to just conclude by summarizing the main points in that section. So what I'm saying in that section is that the computer equipped with a Kantian program has 2 types of rules. There is a rule which is created by the computer and which is supposed to unify the various sensings that the computer receives. And then there are certain constraints which the computer itself applies on the way in which those rules are created and used. So if you want, there are 2 types of rules. There is a first order rule, and then there is a second order type of rule. The second order applies to the first order. And because we have this idea of second order rules which apply to the first order rules, that gives it a structure which seems quite similar to the structure of consciousness. Because what happens in the case of a conscious agent is that the agent can reflect on its own thinking processes and can constrain them in various ways. So my guess is that those who claim that the computer equipped with a Kantian program is a cognitive agent claim this in virtue of this analogy between a conscious being and the computer who has these two types of rules. Now, we could see that there is something similar going on in the case of a human agent, a conscious agent, given that there is this synthetic unity of our perception, which seems to operate as a kind of second-order rule for the agent. But nevertheless, it looks like there is a huge gap between between the computer and us. There seems to be a huge gap between a computer which, as far as I can see, is still merely a sensory agent and a cognitive agent. And to see this, I used this example of a slightly more complex thermostat, one which, apart from the temperature sensor, also has a sensor for atmospheric pressure. So the thermostat no longer regulates temperature in an aquarium, but in a recipient where the liquid should not go over the boiling point. And it's well known that the boiling point occurs at a lower temperature when the pressure is reduced. So the thermostat, this more complex thermostat, measures continuously air pressure and the temperature of the liquid in order to avoid the boiling of the liquid. So the reason why I use this example is that in the case of this more complex thermostat, we again have two types of rules. There is a first order rule, and then there is a second one. There is first the rule which takes into account what the boiling point is, but that depends on a second rule concerning pressure. So we have again two types of rule. One is first order, the other one is second order. But the point is that even this more complex thermostat is far from being a cognitive agent. It's very far from being able to count its sensings as representations of the external world and count what it's doing as, in any sense, representing or presenting a particular aspect of the external world, such as the boiling point of a liquid. So similarly, for a computer equipped with a Kantian program, despite the fact that there might be many rules, some first order, second order, which are very complex, it seems that the computer still functions in a way which is very far from what a human being does when they count themselves as doing a particular action or other, as representing what they are doing as being an activity of a particular kind or other. So that's the conclusion. So the conclusion is that that computer is not yet a cognitive agent. Now, this shouldn't be taken as merely a negative point. What I say in the paper is that we should take this as a starting point for thinking, what exactly do we need? What exactly does a computer need in order to make this to bridge this gap from the sensory to the cognitive agent? How exactly can we make that work? So what we need is a bit more investigation into this process of original intentionality and these conscious processes, which would help us perhaps at some point to end up with a computer who might not simply be a sensory but also a cognitive agent. Thank you.